advanced Fiddler techniques. That's my Twitter information. A little bit about myself. I am a progress ninja for Fiddler. So I'm one of the few people in the world that do a lot of talks around Fiddler. So that's like an MVP, like Microsoft MVP from Progress related to Fiddler. So I have used it for an extremely long time. I actually looked and found the first capture I have saved was from like 2008. So I have been using it for quite a while. Again, my Twitter, my email, and my blog. I do have links to the slides, and so at the very end I will give you that. And if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll try to take them throughout the talk, or we'll have time at the end as well. So first we're going to talk about HTTP. So HTTP is the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So this is the protocol used between the browser and the web server. And so I gave you some links to the actual RFCs here. So the first one is HTTP 1.1. So that has been around for a really long time. The RFCs are actually pretty approachable. So if you do have specific questions about how browsers and servers are supposed to behave, that would be a good reference. I've actually looked through it to see how is caching supposed to work. You can't guarantee that the browsers and servers are actually going to comply with those standards, but they are pretty readable if you want to see how things should behave. I also gave you a link to HTTP 2. I put it in italics just because Fiddler presently does not support HTTP 2. So if you actually open up Fiddler, your connection will basically downgrade to use HTTP 1.1. HTTP is a request and a response paradigm. So you'll see the browser is going to make a request, get a response back, and both the request and the response have both a header and a body that we'll see here throughout the talk. So what is Fiddler? So it's a tracing tool that was built specifically for HTTP and HTTPS. So Eric Lawrence was working at Microsoft on the clip art team. People would purchase clip art, try to download it, something wouldn't work. They would try to call in, and Eric noticed the support staff would have a hard time helping them troubleshoot why things didn't work. So back then, the tools were primarily Netmon from Microsoft, which is very similar to Wireshark. And so Eric didn't know C#, he didn't know HTTP, he didn't know .NET, decided that he would go out and write Fiddler, which I think is cool. It was acquired by Telerik in 2012, now owned by Progress. And there's actually two different types of Fiddler. Fiddler Everywhere is the new cross-platform, so it runs on both Mac and Linux. Fiddler Classic is the one from Windows, and that's the one I'm primarily going to show tonight. I'm going to end up showing both, but a lot of the advanced topics we'll go through in this talk specifically are only supported in Classic at this point. So they've been adding features into Fiddler Everywhere, but the ones that require Classic. So I'm going to stay in Classic at the beginning. There will be techniques that do cross over, so at the end I'll show you Fiddler Everywhere and I'll mention the ones, and I have a slide that talks about what is not yet in Everywhere. So how does Fiddler work? It's important to understand this because it's different than a Wireshark would be. So if you start up Wireshark, you're telling it to monitor a network interface. So basically all the traffic that goes through your Wi-Fi or your Ethernet is being caught by a tool like Wireshark. Fiddler is actually a proxy, and by a proxy, Fiddler is just another application I'm running, in my case on Windows, on a certain port. And I need to direct traffic specifically to that app for it to be traced. So that's why they call it a proxy. By default, when you open up Fiddler, it will tell, in my case Windows, that it's running on a certain port, and modern browsers all pick that up. So if your browser is configured to take whatever your system proxy settings are, which is the default, when we start up Fiddler, you'll see it changes that, and it will route the browser's traffic to Fiddler. So let's take a look at what this looks like by default. So I'm going to go, I use the new Edge browser, so I'm going to go into the system settings and look at the proxy settings. So by default, you can see I'm not using a proxy. I'll close that. I'm going to go start up Fiddler Classic. And once this starts, I'm going to go back. So now it has indicated to Windows that it's running. So if I come back in and look at proxy settings, you can see that it now has a manual proxy set up. So if you've seen Could have worn that t-shirt, I guess. There's no place like 127.0.0.1, which is the IP address for my own machine. So essentially it's told Windows, I'm running on this machine on the default port of 8888. If I go to the right, it also is doing it for HTTPS. So at this point, my browser says if I'm using one of those two types of traffic, it's going to route it through those settings, which will force it to go through Fiddler. So the reason that that's important is as you're troubleshooting, it's not uncommon for people to wonder why they're not seeing traffic in Fiddler. So just be aware if it's not a modern browser, you might actually have to go manually configure a proxy setting. And I'll show you a couple times throughout the talk where you'll need to do that. I'm going to talk about web sessions. So I'm an ASP.NET developer, and so I think of a web session as a series of requests made in ASP.NET. This is actually, from a Fiddler perspective, a single request and response. Jason, do you want to mute whoever's got that going? So there's a web session. So when we talk about web sessions from a Fiddler perspective and the documentation, it's actually just a single request and a response. I just want you to know that if you're used to thinking about a bunch of requests and responses, this is actually just a single. So there's a number of things I can do with an individual session. So I'm going to pull up, I have a page here. It's just a fictional travel page. I'm going to hit Control F5 to make sure that it's tracked. And I can see the requests that are coming through here. So a couple things that I can do. I can look at this bootstrap. You can actually right-click on a session, and there's a lot of things available right here. So it's not uncommon for me. I'll be troubleshooting. I work with vendors. I work with our security group. I work with our ops group. So it's not uncommon for me to need to be able to point out to people a certain thing in the trace. So I'm going to go first and say I want to mark this as orange, so that when I send it to somebody, I can say the ones that are in orange are the ones I'm concerned about. I can add a comment, say like upgrade this, whatever I need to talk about, and that will be visible if they have their comments enabled at the very end. So that's useful. I can also actually save off the file. So if I saw that this used Bootstrap or maybe my company logo and I need to use it on another site, I can just come say save response body, and it'll give me the opportunity to actually save off that individual file. So that's useful as well. A couple other things, you can have it replay requests. We'll talk about some of these other things in here as we go. But that's some of the main things I'm going to do. We're also able to search. So it's not uncommon. I've got a pretty large website. And so usually instead of having 12 requests for my page, I might have nearly 100. So if I look through, I might notice that there's this font being requested. And I might say, you know, I don't remember specifically including that myself. So I want to figure out, why is this font being downloaded? So I can go into Edit, Find Sessions, type Flames, and do a find. By default, it found this down here, the actual font file. Wasn't quite what I was looking for. I was hoping it would identify where did that get pulled in from. So one of the things that took me a while to figure out in Fiddler years ago was I use compression for performance on all of my pages. By default, Fiddler does not decompress the content to search within it. So I'm going to say decode compressed content and say find sessions. Now it shows me that bootstrapmin.css is the file that referenced this. So I can say, okay, I guess I'm using Bootstrap, so that's why that got requested. It might have pointed out my own CSS or a JavaScript file or the HTML, but at least now I know why that request was made. A couple years after the searching stuff, they made it a lot easier. I can actually just right-click on this and say I want to find the parent request. So if I pick the parent request, it immediately identifies Bootstrap, and I can do vice versa. I can say I want to select all the child requests that came out of that Bootstrap, and it would indicate all the child requests that were made because of that file. Another cool thing you can do is you can use Alt key. So if I look at this, I'm going to slide this over just a hair so we can see this a little better. If I looked at this and said I want to find all of the other files that are CSS, I can hold the Alt key And if I click on the value in any column, it will find all of the other ones. So I'll actually do JPEGs here. I'm going to click on this image JPEG, and you can see it highlighted all the other JPEGs. So it's a quick way for me, if I know an individual value, that it will actually be able to find all of the other requests that had that same value. Next thing is decrypting HTTPS. So by default, you should be using HTTPS on your website. It doesn't matter, static, dynamic. I have a whole talk, if you don't believe me, on why you should do that. But HTTPS is just HTTP running on a secure channel. People keep using the term SSL. Really, this has been deprecated for a really long time. It's no longer considered secure. You should be using TLS. So the interesting thing about Fiddler is you can actually have Fiddler be a person in the middle. And so because Fiddler is a proxy, I can configure it to decrypt HTTPS. That should disturb you, right? The whole point of HTTPS is that I am trying to make it so someone can't be on the wire between my browser and the server and see the traffic. So now you're telling me Fiddler can decrypt that. So I'm going to show you how it can do it and how it works. So first I'm going to clear this, and I'm just going to go hit a secure page. And if I go back into Fiddler, instead of seeing all the requests that I would expect to see, all I see is this tunnel. So it says there's a tunnel connect. It shows me the host name, but I can't see any of the individual requests. So all of the CSS images, and this is what we want, right? The whole point of HTTPS is I don't want people to see this or be able to tamper with it. If I go under Tools, Options, HTTPS, I can actually pick Decrypt. Now, I've done this on this machine before, so it's not going to give me the same kind of warning, so I'm just going to explain to you what this does. If I say Decrypt, oh, it's going to do it for me. Here we go. So it says, do I want to intercept traffic? So what Fiddler's going to do is it's sitting between the browser and the server. Fiddler is saying, I want to act like I'm a certificate authority. If you know how HTTPS works, you go to a certificate authority like Let's Encrypt. They will give you a certificate with your server's public key. Fiddler is basically saying, I want you to trust me to be a certificate authority for your machine. I'm going to say yes, do that. It'll warn me a couple more times. Are you sure you want to do this? Yes, I do. Are you positive you want to do this? Yes, I am. And I hit OK. So now what it's done is it says any certificate it sees issued by Fiddler on my machine, so it's specific to my machine, I will trust that. So if I come back here now, sometimes I have to restart. So I'm just going to try it. Control F5, and I still have, so I'm just going to close my browser quick, make sure it picks it up. So let's go back and hit that again. Hit Control F5 in case stuff is cached, and now I can see all of the stuff as I would expect. So I can go over in the inspectors, I can see things and look at the raw view, and there it is. So I've intentionally basically granted Fiddler on my machine and said, I trust this, I trust Fiddler. So what Fiddler does is when I hit this particular domain, I have an Azure website, it said, I'm going to create a fake certificate that looks like it came from that server. The client now trusts Fiddler root. So it will encrypt it, send it to Fiddler. Fiddler can decrypt that since it's its certificate. It will then re-encrypt when it goes out to the actual website. So on the wire, it's all still encrypted. But this enables Fiddler sitting in the middle to be able to intercept and decrypt your HTTPS, which is important. So years and years ago, I've been doing web forever, we didn't have any HTTPS. Then we started using it on logins and checkouts where we had credit cards. Back then, Fiddler did not do decryption, and so the issue was I would be fine, I would be able to troubleshoot, and then suddenly I got into the HTTPS part of the site and I couldn't see anything. So the ability now to be able to do that decryption is critical, but that's how it actually functions, and you're explicitly granting it just on your machine. Next thing we'll look at is filters. And so filters are just a quick way for me to do a couple things. I can show and hide sessions, I can block files. So let's take a look at what that looks like. I'm going to clear this out. I'm going to go back and ask for my web page again. I'm just going to do my normal one, hit Control F5. So what I can do is I can come into filters here, and there's a lot of things that I can decide to do or not do. So it's not uncommon when I'm doing a trace that there's other background traffic. So I might have Office open or other apps that are using HTTP that are using the same proxy. So what will happen here is we'll see this list of traffic. I can actually say I only want to see traffic from specific hosts. So I can come up here and say, hide certain hosts, show certain hosts. So if you need to quickly say, I only want to see stuff from example.com, for instance, then as I do tracing, sessions will not show up in the list if I limit it to that specific host. I can also limit it to a process. So if I want, I can open up this process list. Sorry, my clicking. There we go. It will show me instances of all of the different client processes. I can limit it to a specific process. So again, if you're seeing a whole lot of other traffic you don't want to see, you can find which browser instance it's running by process ID and choose to only show that traffic. Now we're going to get into the first step of where Fiddler is more advanced than things like DevTools. I want to be able to actually modify traffic. Because Fiddler is sitting between the client and the server, it can actually take stuff from the client, change it, either going to the server or coming back. So the first one I'm going to show is this request header. So by default, if I look at Bootstrap and I go to the inspectors, you'll see this little bar that says this has been encoded. And if I look at the transformer, you can see it's about 27K and it's gzipped. So what I want to do is come into filters and say, anytime a request comes through, the way compression works, the browser will send to the server and say, I accept encoding, and it will list gzip or Brotli or deflate. I'm telling Fiddler, when you see the request come in, please take that header off. I want to act like the client does not support compression. So now that I have that turned on, if I were to go back, hit Control F5 and come back into Fiddler, now you'll notice that it's 122K because it's not compressed. Why would I want to do that? It's a good way to be able to test. There's not always easy ways to make browsers do things in a way that you need to in order to test. So this would be a good way. It's not easy for me to say current edge does not support compression, so I can do that here. Some other things I can do, I can hide if I don't want to see not modified requests or certain other requests, I can do that. I can block file types. So I'm going to just say, please block CSS files. Let's go back and look what our page looks like if I hit Control F5. Okay, not unexpected. It looks pretty horrible, right? Again, why would I want to do this? Well, I'd want to do this because it might happen, right? I host CSS files on my CDN, Content Delivery Network. So I have had the case where my CDN happened to be down, and I want to know what my site's going to do if someone can't pull that CSS file. How do I react to this? I won't get into the technique here, but if you've heard of critical CSS or inlining CSS, there are tools that will let you run and find out just the important CSS you need for the above the fold viewport. You can actually then take that CSS and embed it directly into the HTML. It's typically done for performance, but it would also give me fallback in this case. So again, it's just kind of cool that it's easy to do and test using filters. Lastly, if you need to be GDPR or CCPA compliant and you care which ones of your requests set cookies, you can just say, I want to flag responses that set cookies. If I were to re-request, I don't have any in this sample page, but if any of these did set a cookie, they'd be in italics. So it's a quick way for me to spot check who is setting cookies on my site so I can go see privacy policies and everything else that were being compliant. I'm going to show you a lot of different ways throughout the talk to do these same things. These are just a simple way if you want a quick user interface and it happens to work. You can come into filters and just make some of the changes right there. Now we're going to the real cool stuff with Fiddler. So Fiddler actually got its name from Composer originally, where you can fiddle with requests. So basically, you're sitting between the client and the server. You can make modifications. So you can create them manually. I'm not personally that bored, so I'm going to go do it this way. I'm going to open up Composer. I'm going to go back and make a request. I'm just going to pick one of these files. Let's just do the bootstrap min. I'm going to drag it. I can drop it into the composer. So this was the full request that was made by the browser to get that file. I'll stick with the theme we're on. I'm just going to manually delete the accept encoding and then hit execute. So Fiddler now executed it without that, and you can see again that there's no compression. So I do this a lot for security testing. It's hard again to make browsers do certain things. I can literally change anything about the request and see what happens. So a better example for security testing, I've got this super cool convertible tablet thing here, and I want to buy one of those. So it says it's $1,095. So I'm going to hit checkout. And I see a post here. I'm just going to drag that over to Composer and take a look at it. So here's the post. That's the page. And as I scroll through here, something jumps out at me right here. The cost. So the price of that product is being sent by the client. That's strange, right? I'm going to check if the developers are doing things right. I'm going to change that to $1 and hit execute. And I want to see what happens, right? If you're doing your stuff right, you're not taking a price from the client. So I'm going to pull, I took off compression. I'm just going to pop it here into Notepad. If I scroll over here, it says this order will be billed at a cost of $1 each. Oops, right? Somebody did that wrong. Again, that's not easy for me to intercept. It was very simple to drag it over and make that change and see if the server is properly implementing all of its security checks. On the topic of security, I work with firms that will send and say, here's a curl command that lets you prove that something is an issue. So if you use curl, I was searching all over for a good curl client that ran on Windows that I could trust. And it turns out under the scratch pad here, you can actually execute curl commands. So curl is just a command line tool to go issue HTTP requests. So I'm just going to ask for bing.com. Sorry, I got to highlight it, execute, and you can see a request was made to Bing. Get the raw request. You can see it came from curl Fiddler. So just if you didn't know that, there is a curl scratch pad built into the composer. So that's cool. Next thing I want to do is use breakpoints. And so there's a lot of times where I'm working with either a vendor or a site that I don't maintain, or I just want to do some quick testing and see. I don't want to go through a whole change deploy, see what happens, especially when it's in production. I can actually set a breakpoint. So I'm going to go down. There's a quick exec area. I'm going to type BPU, and it's bootstrap-min.css. So what I'm saying is please set up a breakpoint. If you ever see this request, Fiddler, pause before you send it to the server. So let's go re-execute our page. Hit Control F5. And in Fiddler here, you didn't see my taskbar there, but Fiddler will glow because it's waiting on something. And you can see there's no result for Bootstrap. And if I come over on the right, it's basically saying you hit a breakpoint. So if you think about troubleshooting and debugging, I am now looking at the request the client was making to the server, and it's giving me a chance to modify it. So similar to Composer, I'm just going to take off that accept encoding and say run to completion. And you'll see now it sends to the server, it comes back, and again, it's not compressed. So I can modify anything I want on the fly. So I'm going to type BPU and take that breakpoint off. I'm going to do a BP after site.css. So now it's saying let it go to the server, but before you give the response to the client, I want to intercept that. So if I go back and hit Control F5, again, I should be waiting here on site.css, and I'm going to take the compression off. I'm going to look at the styles, and I'm just going to try changing that to red. I just want to see what happens. I'm going to hit run to completion. You'll notice now it's red. So again, why would I do this? So long story short, we started bundling years ago with HTTP 1.1. We bundled all of our CSS files together. It turns out that Internet Explorer has a limit of 4,096 unique styles per style sheet. And it doesn't say that anywhere. So what happened was we did our bundling, everything worked. About a month later, suddenly styles worked everywhere in every other browser, but not in IE. Certain styles were just missing, and I could not figure out why. And I didn't want to keep changing stuff and building and deploying, so I just set up a breakpoint, came in here, and just started tweaking with stuff. And eventually I did the binary search. If you haven't done that before, just whack half the file, run it, and I noticed the style I was worried about then would show up. So I started figuring out that it was size dependent. So it's just an opportunity. The breakpoints let me get in between client and server, and like I said, especially when I can't deploy, if it's a vendor site or something else, I'm just taking off this breakpoint. It allows me to get in between and make modifications before or after. So that is Composer. Next one is autoresponder. So again, because Fiddler is a proxy, it technically can return information to the client without actually talking to the web server. So why would people do this? I've heard of people using Fiddler. They have a really important demo for the VP of whatever, and they're afraid that it's not going to work. You can actually record the actual, you testing it while it works on your machine, whatever. You could save off the responses locally on my laptop and then set up autoresponder rules to say, if you see this request, I want to serve it from my local disk instead of going to the server. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff I can do. So I'm just going to start to show you some of the useful stuff. Let me go back and request again. So one thing I do a lot is I do a lot of performance work. So I want to see what happens if this bootstrap file is slow. So I'm going to go to autoresponder. I'm just going to drag that request over. And there's a lot of stuff I can do. I can return a specific response. Like I can say, pretend that it's a 404. Pretend that it's a 502. I like to do this delay. So I'm going to take, and this is milliseconds, I'm going to make that take 15 seconds and hit save. Now if I go re-execute that again, you'll see it's spinning up here, and it's eventually, this is what my users see, right? People on my site, if my CSS file is slow, this is what they see. Again, it's hard to simulate slowness in a specific request, and that's what autoresponder lets me do, which is handy. So now again, I can consider, should I be using inline CSS possibly? I at least understand how things are going to behave. Another thing I can do is I can right click. So first of all, I could save this off onto my hard drive. I can modify it to do whatever I want, and then set up a rule that says, if you come looking for this file, I want to use the one on my machine. So we have front-end developers. They're not ASP.NET developers that work with us. And they'll often give us CSS that they want us to use on the site. It was hard for them to test in the past. They would give us CSS, I would build it into our site, I would deploy it to the right server, I would send to them, then they could test and see if it worked. By doing this, they could actually just save off the CSS file locally on their own machine. So this developer happened to use a Mac, so they set up Fiddler Everywhere, and it has a similar feature. They basically saved off their local CSS, then they could tweak that CSS file locally on their machine all they want, and they're pulling it off their machine instead of my production server or state server or whatever. So I could do that. I can also just right click and say I want to unlock for editing. I'll go into the inspectors, I'm going to go to the response, and I'm just going to add hello at the end of this, okay? And then I'll go say, take that off. I'm going to then drag that over to autoresponder. And now if I go back and do that, you can see hello shows up here. So if you think about that, it's pretty powerful. I'm sitting between the client and the server, so rather than talk to the server, I'm going to do what you have configured in your rule, and your rule says, please pull this file off the local disk. So again, I've heard of people doing this for demos. Things aren't going well. All they need to do is have their rules and their files set up locally. They kick open Fiddler while nobody's paying attention. Suddenly it's serving everything fast off the local disk, and you don't have a demo failure. So that's one use for doing something like that. Oops. So it's cool that we can do this. So I'm using Fiddler Classic. It runs on Windows. Fiddler Everywhere runs on a Mac and a Linux, but I still have a responsive website. So we support phones, tablets, gaming consoles, whatever, right? Wherever a browser lives on, let's be reasonable, not IE6 anymore. But wherever a browser lives, I want to be able to support them. So let's say it's not uncommon. We have a lot of iPhone users. They might come back and say things aren't working for me. What I want to do is I can't run Fiddler on the actual phone. So what I can do instead is I run Fiddler on my laptop like I always do. And I can configure the client to route its traffic through my machine. So the first step, I go to Tools Options. I can go to Connections, and I can say I want to allow remote computers to connect. You might have firewall issues too. I'm not going to get into firewall stuff on your machine, but this now says if anybody from off box comes looking for port 8888, I'm willing to accept that. Let's look at what you do on a client. We'll do it this way, I guess. Okay, so on an iPhone, it turns out you don't set proxy settings in your browser. It's actually something you'd set in Wi-Fi. So if you go down to the bottom of your Wi-Fi settings, I figured out the IP address of my laptop, and that happened to be what it was when I did the trace. I went on my iPhone and I said I want a manual proxy to that IP address on that port. As soon as I do that now, as I'm browsing on the iPhone, it's being routed through Fiddler on my laptop. So not only can I trace, I can do everything else we're going to talk about during this talk. I could modify the traffic. I'll give you one warning. Today I'm using HTTPS everywhere. You need to get the iOS device to trust the Fiddler root certificate. So if you go out to Teleric's site, they do have a good documentation on how you specifically do that. Like how do you get the certificate out of Fiddler so that you can take it over to your phone and trust it. Then when you do that, you can pull up a website on your phone. And if I pull it up in Fiddler, this is my saved trace. And if I look at it down below, here's the request. And if I look at inspectors, you'll see it's using the iPhone. So that's handy, right? I can actually trace devices and route traffic through my machine. I actually do this nowadays, even if I were to go to somebody within the company and they said, hey, I'm having a problem, I generally don't want to install software on somebody else's machine. So if you've ever done that, you know that about 6 months from now, their printer's not going to work, and somehow it's going to be your fault, right? Because you installed this stuff on their machine. You don't want to forever be responsible for that machine. So I'll actually go onto their device, and I'll manually set their browser's proxy settings to route through my Fiddler. That way I don't have to install anything on the client, but I can get a trace, so you can do that as well. There's also a way to do a reverse proxy. So if you can't set proxy settings on your device, there's actually a way to set up Fiddler so it acts like a reverse proxy. And again, I'll just refer you to the documentation. It's pretty rare that you would need to do that these days, but you can do that so that Fiddler will act like the actual website, and then it will just pass the traffic on to the real server. Talk about some common issues. So I'll show you the one that I do all the time. As soon as I get a good capture, I usually come down here and turn off capturing. I don't want a whole bunch of other page requests or background requests like whatever's going on here to be in my trace. So I turn capturing off. It's not uncommon then that I come back, let's say I clear all this, I go back to my browser and I hit Control F5 and I come back to Fiddler and no traffic, and I forget why. So if you do that, just be aware, check down here to make sure you're doing the capture. The other thing you can do is you can actually drag this and drop it on a specific browser instance. So one of the things that Eric said happened a lot with this feature is people would drag it and drop it onto their current, in my case, Edge instance. They would do all their stuff, close that browser, open it up again, they get a different process ID, and they don't see traces anymore. So if you do that, just come back and click up here so it says any process. You can also filter out. So if you're seeing a bunch of other background stuff, you can say, I just want to see browsers or just non-browsers. So check these 3 spots if you're not seeing traffic in here and you know that normally you would. So that's one of the issues. The other thing is, so I'm an ASP.NET developer. I'm running IIS and the ASP.NET server stuff on my laptop, so I'm both the client and the server. So by default, I open up Fiddler, does tracing just fine, but my ASP.NET code will call third-party HTTPS resources, and they're not going to be tracked in Fiddler. And it's curious why, right? I can see the client to the server, but I can't see the server calls even though you're using HTTP or HTTPS. It turns out that by default, the .NET classes are not proxying your traffic. So by default, that won't get recorded. I can actually go in and set this in my config file and just say I want to route all of my traffic from these classes to also go to Fiddler on that port, and then I'll see that traffic. So generally, if you have a client that you know uses HTTP or HTTPS, but you're not seeing the traffic in Fiddler, check these things first and then make sure that that client traffic is being proxied, because you have to intentionally send it over to Fiddler as if it were a proxy. It just doesn't do that by itself. Okay. Next thing we'll talk about is FiddlerScript. So FiddlerScript is, he called it JScript.net. It's kind of JavaScripty and also uses .NET objects. So it'll look very similar if you've done JavaScript stuff before. FiddlerScript lets me programmatically intercept and modify traffic. So there's going to be a couple functions that will fire where I can make modifications. So I'm just going to go into Rules, Customize Rules. And it's going to pull up an editor. I'm going to hit Control F and just search for my stuff. So I've got this function, this event that fires on before request. So this is the client browser sending to the server. This will get fired. So I can look in here and say, I want to see if the session contains .jpeg. I want to color it yellow for some reason. So I'm going to save that and go back. I'll hit Control F5. And if I come back, you can see those are now yellow. So it's not just changing how things look. That's one thing that I can do. Where I use this feature, I actually have done this. I've wanted to see what happens if I made every third party our site used die, and so, or be slow in this case. So I'm specifically looking, if you're my website, you're okay. A couple other of our hosts are okay. But I want to know if any third party analytics or tracking or whatever, if any of those things are slow in this case, I want to see if it impacts my rendering. So I can run this code in here, go back, hit Control F5, and I would be able to see anybody who's slow. Does it make my page blank? Does it make it where I can't click on it? So it's a very handy way to be able to see if I have any impact from other people, if that makes sense. There's an on before response, so I can capture it on the way back. There's also an onExec action. So I showed it briefly before down here in the quick exec. I can type things like CLS. So there's a whole command line interface. If you like command line interfaces, there's a bunch of stuff built into Fiddler. I'm going to show you, if I were to go out and I'm not responsible, I have no idea what's going to be on Bing's homepage today, so I won't even show it for long. I'll just skip over to here. But I can see it's making requests out to www.bing.com. I also noticed there's this businessbing.com. I wanted to be able to type my own, so I typed business.bing.com. And it actually takes those out of the session list. So I extended Fiddler myself by overriding inside of this onExec action function. I can actually intercept and do what I want to do to change how things look. So I just wrote that myself because I often wanted to take hosts out from this list, and I wanted it to be a convenient way to do that. There are also a lot of Fiddler extensions. So if you go out to this add-on link, I'm going to focus on two of them, JavaScript Formatter and Image Bloat. So for performance reason, I minify all of my JavaScript and CSS files. So if I go back and hit Control F5, you'll see I've got minified files here. So one of the extensions is make JavaScript pretty. So what I want is, if I want to use minified files because they're smaller and in production they're going to run better, However, when I'm in the client and I go into DevTools and I want to do some troubleshooting and I'm stepping through code, I'm going to be looking at stuff that's minified. And so that might be hard for me to step through the code because it looks like that. I can use this pretty print feature, but I have to do that for every file individually. If I turn on this make JavaScript pretty, I'll go back and hit Control F5 because Fiddler's a proxy. It's going to intercept all of those minified files, and it shows you which ones. And essentially, it will unminify them, if that's a word, and show it to me. So now on the client, I don't have to do that for each file. So that's kind of handy. Real life, I use source maps, if you're familiar with that. So we actually have a source map file in part of our build process that will, when you have DevTools open, the map files are a mapping from the minified to the original, which is better because I can actually see the original source, not just one that has the spacing right, because some of the variable names will still be different when I use Pretty Print in DevTools or I use this extension. The other one that's cool is show image bloat, so I'm going to turn that on. Let's go back and hit Control F5. And you notice it says it's got some bricks here, and it says 10K of 23K. So 43% of that image size is due to metadata. So if you take pictures with your camera or your phone, part of the information that goes into the image files is metadata. Like what was your shutter speed, what was your camera, possibly what's your lat long. Don't do that, but that's all embedded in the image file. None of that contributes to the visual look of the image. So basically 43% of the time my customers are wasting time downloading bytes they're never going to show because it's just metadata. So I use a tool called JPEGTran that will strip all the metadata out. So in all of our production images, we strip the metadata. This extension lets me have a quick way to visually walk through a site and double check that I don't have metadata. And you can see I did it right for all of these, but I did it wrong for all these. All of those have about 43% of the image size is due to metadata. So that's a cool extension. Take that off and clear this. You can write your own. So if you're ambitious, I have a Pluralsight course that walks through how you can write your own extensions. Next thing I'll talk about is FiddlerCap. So I have had non-technical people at work that were remote that I wanted to capture traces for. There's a new thing that just got launched actually called Fiddler Jam, which is a browser extension that you can put in that does something very similar to this. It's a lighter footprint. So you turn that on and it will capture traces for you, let you share it with development teams, do all sorts of cool stuff. FiddlerCap was the original, so I'm just going to start this. And what FiddlerCap does is they install it on their machine. Again, I would prefer not to install stuff, but if they're remote, what's cool about this is they can do things that they might not know how to do, like how do I clear all my cookies, how do I clear my cache. They can say they want to decrypt, then they just hit start capture. It'll open up a browser, they can do everything they want to do. I know this never happens to you, but I occasionally get told your website didn't work without any handy info. It's nice to get a trace, but they can also hit this snapshot. What that will do is it will take a snapshot of the current screen and embed that right in the trace. That way when they're done, they're going to hit stop, save. They'll email me that trace. I'll open it in real Fiddler, and it'll look just like it was captured by Fiddler. And if they did snapshots along the way, it'll have the screenshot so I can see exactly what was wrong on the screen, which is very handy. A couple miscellaneous things. I showed that you can save response files. You can also do screenshots within here. So let me hit Control F5. So if I come back into Fiddler, there's actually a screenshot right here. I'm going to click it and it'll give me a 5-second countdown. So I'm going to toggle back. And it's doing a little countdown and then simulated camera click on my headphones. And if I look, here's that screenshot. If I look at the image view, I can see what the screen looked like. So that's something you can do in Fiddler as well, especially if you're sending to other developers or security. If there's a message, You don't have to manage screenshots outside of this. You can do it and have them embedded directly inside. You can encrypt your files. So I wish this was a little more obvious, but I'll do file save all sessions. So I often save archives. So I'll test something on my site before and after. I'll do the before, I'll save an archive, I'll give it a date. You can't believe how often I'll go back 6 months and say, what did the site look like 6 months ago? Did we have this, was compression off, or was I doing caching the way I was supposed to? So I have a good history of our site in traces. So one of the things I can do, if I'm going to send this, especially in email somewhere else, I want to pick password protected. So I'm just going to put A here for now. It'll come up and ask me to pick a password. So if you notice, it's using 128-bit AES encryption. So it's good encryption. You can actually configure to use 256-bit if you want to. So it's using serious cryptography. There have been tools in the past where you use password stuff, and it's pretty weak. Obviously, I have to choose a decent password. And when I send the encrypted file, I'm not going to put the password in the same email, right? So don't do that. But the idea is you can have serious encryption. If you're sending this anywhere outside of your own company, you certainly should be encrypting that using that password feature, because it does potentially contain sensitive info. You potentially decrypted HTTPS, you might have passwords, certainly have IPs, things you don't want other people to see. Fiddler does have a text wizard. So I've been doing some capture the flag contests, and so you often have to convert between values. So if I click this text wizard, you can see I can do a lot of things. Base 64 encode, hex encode, compute hashes of things. So it's just nice to have that inside of Fiddler, because I'm often trying to do those kinds of conversions when I'm doing capture the flag things and other testing. You can write your own inspector. So there are default inspectors for all the things you'd normally see, like CSS and JavaScript. Early on, when people were doing things like binary WCF, right? It wasn't a protocol that Fiddler knew by default. You could actually go create your own extension, or inspector, excuse me, build it into Fiddler, and then you could decode so that you could show a logical view. So if you have something that you trace that's in a proprietary format, you might want to write your own inspector for that, which is possible. I'm going to mention Fiddler Core. So at one point, Eric chose to take all of the features of Fiddler that do the tracing. He basically made a headless version of Fiddler and called it Fiddler Core. And what that let you do is you could embed all of the capturing and replaying and those sorts of features into your own .NET program. So you could basically get Fiddler Core and build it into your app. So people have done that to do things like testing clients, right? They want to be able to automate some tests. They could use Fiddler Core and all the Fiddler features without having to use the user interface. You can spoof user agents if you need to do that. If you go set a specific user agent, there's some default ones. Netscape 3 brings back memories. I can make a custom one, but essentially now, because the traffic flows through Fiddler, it will change whatever the client says it is to this. It's not going to change, obviously, how the client is going to run, but if your server sent back different data for Edge versus Chrome versus Firefox, you'd be able to see if the server is reacting differently to a different user agent. Talked about the quick exec, and so down here there's a bunch of features. So I can say maybe I want to see greater than 50,000, and it will highlight the sessions up above here that are above 50K. I can do less than 1,000, so less than a K, I just have one. I can type CLS, I can clear everything. Well, before I do that, I can say select CSS, and it will find all the CSS files and highlight them. I can type CLS and clear instead of having to go up and do it here. So just a lot of things I can do via the command line. I can do host remapping. So I'm going to go out to example.com. And I'm going to spoof using Fiddler and say, I want to do a host remapping under tools. If you see example.com, I really want you to route it to my local host, port 86, whatever happens to be running there. So now if I go back and hit Control F5, it's the site we've been walking through all day. So why would I do this again? So I learned this feature and I kind of had it tucked away for years because I didn't know why I'd want it. It turned out I was troubleshooting, and so I wanted to, we had a production problem, and I wanted to be able to step through it in Visual Studio on my laptop, but the libraries I was testing cared that the domain said www rather than my own machine. So I set up host remapping. So the browser thinks it's talking to www.example.com, but I actually routed it to my website on my machine where I had Visual Studio, so I could step through and do all the debugging, and yet everything else thought it was still in production. So that was a useful thing for me to be able to use. Turn that back. So now we've got through Fiddler Classic, all the advanced stuff. I just want to show you a little bit about Fiddler Everywhere. So Fiddler Everywhere is basically the redo of Fiddler with a reimagined user interface. And so it's a lot more streamlined. The other big win is it's multi-platform. So if you want to be able to run Fiddler on Mac or Linux, this is your chance. It also has a lot of collaboration features built into it. So I'm going to show you quickly how that works. I just want to mention that there are missing features still, like the extensions, the Fiddler script, the breakpoints, the quick exec. Some of the advanced things I've showed you today are just not available yet. They're working on getting that in place. So I'm going to open Fiddler Everywhere here. And again, cross-platform is a big win. I'm going to go back. Hit Control F5 here. Okay, so this is the new user interface. I've got my sessions here for capturing, so I'm going to go hit Control. I'm going to exit the site and hit Control F5. So this will look very familiar, right? Here's my HTML request, my other ones. I can right-click and do the same sort of things that I could do before. I can add in a rule. So autoresponders have been renamed rules. So I can add a new rule here for Bootstrap. And if I go edit it, I can do the same thing we saw before. I can make it delay for 15,000 milliseconds. If I were to go back and hit Control F5, I'll see it's going to sit. It's waiting here. This will go blank. So a lot of the autoresponder features are now built here in the rules. I can also right-click and edit this in Composer. So Composer here gives me a nice view. I could just take off the accept encoding and ask to execute it again, and then go back and see it in my list. You can see here the Bootstrap now is not compressed anymore. I can turn on and off capturing a little easier. So there's just interface things that are more modern and streamlined. So those are some of the features. I can save off previous sessions. So something that was hard in Classic was I had a previous capture of a page. I can open it, and within the same instance, I can kind of bop back and forth and compare the two of them. That was not easy to do in a Classic world. I can also save off individual sessions. So this is more if I had API requests and stuff, I can save them off here and then just reissue them directly from here. And I can also collaborate. So I can say I want to share this with other people, and I can put in email addresses, and it has cloud-based collaboration storage and a lot of other stuff. So again, I encourage you, if you're not using the newest or the advanced features, that are only in Classic, take a look at Fiddler Everywhere, and especially, like I said, if you're on a Mac or Linux, it's the only way that you could run it. I do have 2 Pluralsight courses. The newer one is Fiddler. It's basically you have a problem with your website, here's your problem, and it will tell you should you use Fiddler or should you use DevTools in the browser to troubleshoot, or both, which is the right one. So it'll say, hey, you have a style problem. Here's the right tool to use. So that's my newer one. The older one here goes into a lot more detail about Fiddler, how do you write custom extensions, all of that kind of stuff. So you can see that there. Eric wrote a really good book on Fiddler Classic, 2nd edition. You can follow the link here. So I've read it, I don't know, probably 10 times. and I always find something that I didn't know that Fiddler could do. And one of them was that hosts example. I said, well, that's cool, but why would I do that? I just remembered that someday when I need to, I can come back in here and figure out why. So if you're using Classic and want to see a lot of this stuff, obviously from the person who wrote it originally, check that out. That's my Twitter, my email, blog. That's my link to the slides. I don't actually have any code with this one, but you can go get the slides from there. So I'll leave that up for a moment, and then we have time if people have any specific questions. So I don't know, Jason, if there was anything in chat that we want to go through, or you want people to unmute.
I don't see anything in chat. Feel free to unmute and ask your question if you have it. That's fine. Or
if you don't, you can always follow up with me later. That's fine as well. I'm glad it all made that much sense, right? That nobody has any questions.
Yeah, there's a lot of cool features that I'm like, hey, I had a problem that I wish I would have cracked that open and had that feature.
Same. I've used it for so long that I will struggle with something. Like we had, like I said, the people that helped contribute CSS to our site, we were going through that process of taking it from them, building, deploying, getting back to them. That made them wait a long time sometimes to find feedback. So once I showed them how to do the rules in Fiddler Everywhere, they can just sit and tweak on the fly on their own machine until they see it's happy. And they can also do it against production, right? I can't just deploy to prod and hope for the best. They can actually test in the real production environment, but pull the files off their own machine. And we just, I hadn't thought of it for a while. So I keep stumbling across new use cases where I just hadn't thought of ways to use it before that I am using now. So,
yeah. All right.
Okay.
Got some good feedback there for you in the chat.
All right.
Cool.
So with that, I will unshare here in case you have something else that.
Nope, that's about it.
Okay.